Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and in today's video we're going to look at DForce and how we can use DForce Simulation to create really cool gravity effects with the props and clothing and items in our scene. So let's get to it. So welcome to this DForce tutorial that I'm going to go through now in Daz Studio. And DForce is a great tool to use. It's very similar to what I covered earlier, which was deformers, but DForce gives you realistic clothing and gravity effects on your items. Now it doesn't work on all items, so that's a case of testing what items will work and what doesn't. So clothing works pretty well, some props work really well as well, so not all props work brilliantly. What you'll find is that the mesh will explode, and that means it doesn't really work, or you'll have to change some of the settings in the DForce service parameters. So first, before we begin, all I've got here is just a t-shirt, a Genesis 8 t-shirt, and I've positioned it in this angle, and this is just a normal chair, normal prop chair, nothing fancy at all. Now before I run the simulation, let's find out where DForce is first. So simulation settings here, the tab here. So if you don't have that tab, it should be here, but if it isn't here, you can always go to Window, tabs, and then panes, and then go to simulation settings. There we go. So that should be there anyway. And when you get this tab, when you click on it, the first thing to do is make sure you go to advanced, and make sure you set your device here to either, if you've got a graphics card, choose your graphics card. So obviously I've got two here, and I can only choose one, unfortunately. It would be great if I could choose two, then obviously the simulations will go a lot faster. So definitely get your graphics card to use that instead. Don't use your CPU unless your CPU is way powerful than your onboard graphics, then go ahead and use that instead. So once we've done that, we go to editor, and now we can see all the settings. So the first setting that we have, that's wrong first of all, that should be 1. The first setting that we have is gravity and air resistance. I'm not going to go through all the settings because there is someone on the forums and the Daz 3D forums that has put a lot of time and effort into going through all the settings and gives you a clear explanation of what each setting does. And that will be in the link in the description, so definitely check that out. Highly recommended. This person's done so much work. This is where I learned most of the stuff as well. He's gone through some fantastic work and gone through all the settings in DForce, and you can literally go through that documentation very clearly laid out, and you can work it out yourself what parameters you need to change and when you need to do it. But I'm going to go through a very quick tutorial here, so let's get started with that. So I've got my item positioned here, I've got my chair positioned here, and so my gravity is set to 1, and that means obviously gravity is times 1. So what will happen is when I press simulate, actually before I do simulate, what should happen is this clothing item should go down on the chair and should act like it's been thrown on the chair, like it's folded over as well. So before we do that, another thing I recommend you do is you go to the initialization and always turn this off. Start bones from memorized pose to off. I don't know why this feature's there. I haven't used it at all. It's always set to on for some reason, but always check it to off. What this feature does is if you're having a character, one of your figures, it will always start in that T pose or A pose, and then it will start running the simulation from there. Highly recommended not to use that T pose or A pose. It really should be turned off, I think, because it just causes so much problems when you're doing DForce simulations with clothing and other things. So always turn that to off. And then the duration, I always use the animated timeline. It's normally set to current frame. I hate that. I hate it with a passion. Always set it to animated timeline, and what that means is we can use the timeline here at the bottom. So 30 frames per second. So if you don't have the timeline, again you go to Window, Panes, and then Timeline, and then that will pop, and just drag it to the bottom where it normally is. When you start off with Daz Studio, if you haven't deleted this timeline, it should always be at the bottom of the screen. It'll probably be like this, and you just click on the tab and it will open up. So I always use timeline because we can choose a specific part of the timeline where we like the simulation, and then we can use that again and again. So that's it. And then the quality and collision, these really don't matter too much. The only one I would probably look at is the collision, is this collision mode here. Now generally we would use better. Better is the optimal kind of collision mode when you're trying to collide clothes with props or anything similar to that. That works. Sometimes you'll have to use good, depending on the clothing type. Okay, so I think that's enough for the explanations for now. Like I said before, check out that link in the description if you want a more detailed explanation of all these settings and the other settings. So before we even do simulation, I need to actually tell Daz Studio that I want DForce applied to this object. So I need to select my object. I need to go to Edit. I need to go to Object. I need to go to Geometry, and I need to go to Add DForce Modify Dynamic Surface. Now, static surface will go into some other tutorial, but it's clearly explained in that Daz 3D forum about DForce, so you can have a look at that as well. But the one we're going to use is dynamic surface here, so I'm going to add that. So what that does is when I go to my Surfaces tab, and I click on Mega Wardrobe, if I go down now here, you will see some extra options. So all these red ones here are all the different options you get with DForce. Now, like I said, I won't go through all the settings. These settings that I've got for these default settings work very well with clothing, but you can really go into much detail and get some really nice folds in your clothing and really cool stuff. So definitely check out that documentation in the Daz 3D forum. I will link in the description box, so check that out. And now what I'm going to do now is hit the simulation, and I'm going to show you what happens. So I'm going to hit simulation, and you see what will happen is this happens here. Now, because I've got a very quick graphics card, it's going through the calculations. So the more kind of resolution or of the actual clothing you have, the longer it will take to do the calculations there that it just did. And that obviously depends on the speed of your graphics card. Now, even my graphics card is pretty fast, but when I was doing testing with another piece of clothing, it took forever to kind of do the simulation, to kind of do that kind of calculations of where the clothing should go and everything. So that's what you need to look into as well. Not everything works, and in this case, this is great. It's draped nicely, and I kind of like the way it is, and that looks really cool. Now, we do have a few problems that I'm going to go through with you now. So if we just zoom in here, and if we just have a look, that looks pretty good. Now, what's happened here is you've got this area here. If I just turn it around, see, as you can see, it's gone through. It's the actual clothing's gone through the actual chair here. So the few things we need to check first, if we go back to the parameters of my clothing item, is if we go to the mesh smoothing, make sure the collision item, it will probably be blank. Make sure it's set to whatever the item's colliding with. So at the moment, I've got my t-shirt here and it's colliding with the chair. So my collision item is the chair. So that's selected. Great. And what I was going to do is I can change the smoothing iterations. So it'll normally be set to something like 2, and then you want to set to something like 10. 10 is a pretty good number to start off with. So that's pretty good as well. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So the other problem I have here is this here. So to sort that out, the only way to sort that out, really, a simple method of doing that is to actually move the clothing item up. So we'll go to General, and we would literally move it up. So I would go plus. There we go. And there we go. Now, obviously, when you come from this side, you can see the clothing is actually a bit too high here. But because I want the scene from this side, it's okay. And then when I do my IRA preview, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty realistic. So what else we can do is, if I say, for example, if we just get out of the IRA preview mode, sometimes you'll find that with the clothing, the folds aren't that good. So the way to get our folds a bit more realistic is we can make our timeline longer. So we can go here. At the moment, it's set to 31 frames. I would get rid of that and do 60. So type in 60, press enter. And now you can see the timeline's gone longer. And then I could do the simulation again. And you see the simulation running. Again, it does the calculations. It's working out where this clothing item is going to go. It does a simulation. Now it's going to go all the way to 59 frames. It's not going to go to 60, but well, 60 frames if you include frame 0. And you can see, you'll see some extra folds, this movement here. So you can see the movement. So it's going to move back and forth until it settles. So it's really doing the cool simulation that we all like, realistic gravity. And you can see it's gone down again, see it's come off. So we let it run for 60 frames. That's the reason why I chose 60 frames. Otherwise I would have chosen something ridiculous like 100 frames, but that would have made this tutorial a lot longer. So there we go. I think it's starting to settle now, and it's kind of said, right, this is where the natural fold should be. So with the timeline, what I could do now is I can go back and say, you know what, I like it around about here. So this is a great thing about using a timeline. Very, very great idea to use a timeline for your simulations, because you can choose the exact point where you like the folds in your clothing. So maybe something like, I don't know, I like it around about here. So again, we need to go back and say, okay, that looks pretty good. Again, we've got this problem here. What did we do? We just made the translation. So we're going to just move it up a bit. And there we go. That looks pretty good. We do the array preview to make sure everything is a-okay. Make sure there's no poking. There is a bit of poking here, but you can get rid of that during post work. So we can, you know, use our post work techniques to get rid of that. It's not that much really anyway. It's not too bad. We can go up if you want a bit more and then really fix that. There we go. So that's how we do it with clothing. Generally, this is what you would do. And that looks very good. So again, use the timeline to your advantage so you can choose the exact kind of fold you want in your clothing. And this looks really cool. I don't see it very much too often in I don't see this very often in many renders. And I don't know why, but it's really cool to show like realistic gravity of clothing, which is really cool. Now obviously this is very simple. When you're doing it clothing, the DForce that you have with the clothing on figures, it's a bit more complicated because you'll find a lot of poke through and you'll find that things don't work as well for whatever reason, but that's a tutorial for another time. So great, so we've done that, that's great. So now I've showed you how to do it with gravity going down. How about when gravity is the opposite way, gravity going up? So we can do that as well. So I'm going to set the scene up now very quickly with gravity going up and show you what that does as well. So I'm just going to close, hide these, don't need these anymore. I'm going to put that timeline back to 0. I'm going to put the timeline, we'll leave at 60. Oh, actually, we'll leave at 60, that's fine. So what I'm going to do first is create a primitive. So create new primitive. And I'm going to create a cube. And think about cubes or any primitives you're creating that you're going to use for DForce. Have them between 50 and 100 divisions. It's just so you can get better, more realistic kind of DForce on those items, on those primitive items. So if you do accept, there we go. That is probably a bit too big, so I am gonna click on my cube and scale it down. There we go, and I'm gonna just put a another primitive in. I'm gonna put a sphere and click accept, and that is too big as well. Click on my sphere, scale it down, move it up, probably scale it down a bit more. Here we go. So when you're doing negative gravity, you want the item that you, so my cube, I'm going to have my cube go up and then wrap around this cube here. So I don't want my, the item that is colliding with, this one here, I don't want it too high, I want it pretty low because I want it to be just above the kind of collision area, so probably about here somewhere. So that looks good. And I'm gonna click on my cube and tell it that I want it to be add DForce to it. So edit, object, geometry, and add DForce modifier dynamic surface. Okay, and now I need to go back to my environment, and instead of using 1, we use -1. So -1. The maximum you can do is -2. So if I did -2, the gravity will be really fast. It'll go up really fast. So same thing here. If I went to 2 here, +2, the gravity will go down very fast. That's up to you. You can choose any value you want to do from there. I just think the default values work pretty well. And then I hit simulate, and let's see what happens. So there we go. It's wrapping around. The mesh is being stretched, and we're getting this strange, unusual behavior, which is fine. And it's wrapping around, and it's kind of settling, and it's still kind of doing its thing. It's still working out. Now it's kind of, instead of contracting, it's coming out of that contraction, and it's settling. And because it's 60 frames, it's going to go on for 60 frames. Probably should have done 30, but never mind. So there it is. We got some nice lovely folds there. Looks really cool. And we come to an end. Right, so let's have a look at that in RA preview mode. What does that look like? So I just turn this around. So this looks pretty cool. We're using the negative gravity option. So one thing we can do is, if I just take the texture off, we can go back in the timeline and we can get this really cool effect here where there we go. Actually, probably the next one there. There we go, where it looks like someone is actually sitting down. So we've got kind of like a D-force. So you know, compression, when someone sits down on something, you get the compression marks. There's compression marks. Now you could do this with an actual figure. It may take a bit longer because it's interacting with the figure, and then you may get the mesh exploding and doing weird things. But this is the idea of what you can do with negative gravity. So one thing we're looking at here is the cube. It's got some sharp edges and everything. So what we can do with the cube is we can add smoothing to it. So the way we do that is make sure my cube is selected here. I go to edit, I go to object, geometry, and I go add smoothing modifier. And what I can also do is go to edit, object, and geometry, and add convert to sub D. So that makes it a bit more smoother. So if I go to I've got my option now, cube, so you can see mesh smoothing is here. Now if I put the smoothing iterations very high, the actual folds here that you see, you'll start losing these kind of compression here. So if I went to say 10, which is the ideal number, you'll see you'll lose it. You'll lose those folds. So sometimes you want to take into consideration how much you want to do. In this case, I think the default is fine. And then when we have a look at the RA preview, there we go. That looks kind of cool. So that's with our negative gravity, and now we're going to do it with no gravity. Okay, so I've got my character set here. I've got my barrel here, and with the timeline, it's going to go through. My character's going to hit that barrel and start crushing it, and the D-force will do simulation. I've got the gravity to 0 because I want the actual D-force calculations. I want to affect only. I want my figure to hit this, and then the actual D-force will take that into consideration. Instead of acting gravity upon it and starting to crush it, it's actually the gravity of my figure that will start to crush the barrel. Now what I've done here, a quick tip for you guys, is the sphere that I had earlier, I've kind of bolted it on here at the bottom, and what's that going to stop doing is stop the barrel from moving anywhere. It'll kind of, this part of the area will stay still, so that part of the barrel will stay and it won't move. Actually, what I'll do with the sphere is I will move it across a bit in the middle-ish. There we go. Let's check to make sure it's in the middle-ish. A bit of Z translate here. There you go. So what that sphere is going to do is going to hold onto the barrel, and then what will happen is this won't move basically from the bottom. It's kind of like a holder object, and it will hold on to it. So it's a quick tip if you don't want something to move in a simulation, if you want something to come, say, from above and to crush it, you can use that as a holder object. Now this works with other things as well, but that's a quick tip for you guys to use. And let's run the simulation and see what happens. So there we go, starting the simulation. It's trying to move the barrel, but it won't move now. My figure's coming, it's crushing the barrel. And as this simulation is happening, I'm going to show you how to save the morph for this barrel. So you can use the morph again. And this works, this morph you can save for the t-shirt as well. So you can use the morph on that t-shirt as well. So when you're saving morphs as well, it will only work on that item that you saved the morph on. It needs to be the exact same item. If you save the morph and then try to use it on another item, it won't work because the geometry doesn't match. So we'll wait for this to play out. And it's doing a very good job of crushing it. And it's doing something weird now. It's coming back up. There we go. The simulation's running. And we're nearly towards the end. This is probably the reason why people don't do that much DForce simulations, because, well, it takes a lot of time. and it actually does take a bit of effort if you want to do the correct settings and everything. So I'm going to just hide my sphere, I'm going to hide my Genesis male character and have a look at what's happened. So that's pretty good in terms of getting crushed. Now again, with the barrel we can add some more parameters. So again, we can add the edit, object, geometry, and then we can add the smoothing modifier, and then we can add the sub D as well. Now a little point about the sub D, when you add for sub D the mesh resolution, if you do high levels of sub D, the size of the geometry of the actual physics, the size in terms of megabytes goes up. So you don't want to do it too high, and then when you try to do a render, the render is going to be like take ages, because the actual size of the whole scene will like increase like crazy amounts. So the more sub D you do something, the higher resolution it is, the longer it takes to render as well. So that looks pretty good. In terms of the smoothing, let's try 10 and see what happens. See, with the mesh smoothing iteration 10, as you can see here, the actual mesh is starting to explode because we're asking it to do too much. So in that case, I would put it back down and reset it to where it was. And let's have a look at that. That looks pretty good. Okay, some realistic deformations there. This is, I mean, with deformers you would never get anything like this, so this is why DForce is really cool to use. So that looks pretty good. So how do we save it as a morph? So this is the really cool part. So make sure you hide everything in your scene. So I've hidden everything except for the item that I want to save as a morph, and obviously select the item, which I have there, and then I'm going to go to File, Export. Okay, I've got a DForce barrel here. I'm just going to write over that. You could write DForce, you know, I'll call it DForce barrel 2. It doesn't really matter. Save. And all these settings are great. You don't need to change anything there. That's fine. Make sure that says Daz Studio though, and everything else is fine. Don't need to change anything there except. So I can get rid of my barrel for instance. I can go back to my smart content. I can double click my barrel. Okay, so we go to edit, we go to object, and we go to Morph Loader Pro. And choose morphs and DForce barrel 2, and make sure you change the settings. This one here, reverse deformations, right click on that and do yes, and then do accept. And what's happened here, it's saying the geometry didn't match, failed to create morph. So what's happened here is basically the geometry didn't match, it's failed to create the morph, and the reason why that is because this Genesis 8 here male, we didn't hide, actually we should have deleted the male and then saved the morph. And then exported it as an OBJ file. I didn't do that, and that's the reason why it didn't work. Okay, that's not a problem. I will we will go back and do the same thing, because I've saved one earlier, like Blue Peter fashion. We saved it earlier. Here's one I made earlier. So we go to object, edit object, geometry, Morph Loader Pro, and choose morph files, and I use my DForce barrel 1, which I did earlier. So the same thing we're going to do is open that setting here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to do yes for that. Reverse deformations, yes, click accept. Loading morph, creating morph successfully, great. So when I go down here to morphs and start moving this around, you'll see it's going to start moving the morph to how I want it. So maybe like that, and then I can go around and probably say actually I want it something like that. And then you can have a look in iRay, and there's your morph. So you need to be careful when you're doing morphs in terms of hiding things. I think the best thing to do when you're using characters is, once you're happy with the simulation, make sure you actually delete the character and then export the morph. Go to File, Export, and then export the object like that, and then that will work. So the reason why we had that error in the first place was because the Genesis male, all these options here are visible, and the best thing to do is actually delete your figure before you save it as an object. So there you have it, some fantastic information there. 3 different ways you can use the DForce simulations, one with negative gravity, one with positive gravity, and if you're in space then no gravity, which is great. And we also learned how to save our simulation as a morph, so we can use it again and again on that item, which is awesome as well. And don't forget to check out the link in the description box below on all the different DForce settings. It's done very, very well in the Daz 3D forum, so I highly recommend you check that out as well. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to leave a comment down below, that's great as well. Let me know what other tutorials you want me to do as well. And you might want to check out these videos here, they may help you as well. Hit the subscribe button over there, and I'll see you in next week's video.